Hey everyone, and welcome to the first ever Healthy Growing Leaders podcast. I'm Kurt. I'm here with Aaron Southerns and Greg Wines, Dr. Greg Wines, and we are so excited about just getting together. Just Greg, sorry, we'll just call you just Greg. But we're so excited to get together each week to talk about leadership, and we want this just to be an honest conversation with Dr. Greg and with others about leadership and what does healthy leadership look like in today's day and age. And so we are so excited to talk about that today. And each week we'll have a new topic and we're going to talk about things. This isn't like your average leadership podcast. We were talking about how is this different than every other leadership podcast that's out there. And we want to talk about in depth about becoming healthy and growing leaders, not just tactics and skills that we need as leaders, but how do we also get healthy? And so we're going to be talking about things like psychology and assessments and building organizations and making sure that you're taking care of yourself as a leader. So we're so excited to jump in. Today, we're talking about the future of leadership. But before we begin, I want to just introduce the people that are here with me. So Aaron, can you just give a little overview of who is Aaron Southerns?
Yeah, so I'm Erin, and I am in Dayton, Ohio, right in the Midwest here. And I help train and lead the assessment team at Healthy Growing Leaders. And my husband and I have been in ministry for over 17 years. We have 4 kids that are spread out elementary and middle school. We're hitting the teenage years, so pray for the wisdom and parenting there. But love being a part of the HGL team, been on staff here for about 2 years.
Awesome. And we're excited to have you on here because you have a wealth of knowledge on not just helping run churches, but also on helping advise leaders along the way. So we're excited to have you. And I'm Kurt. I am out of Seattle, Washington area, Tacoma, Washington to be exact. I was formerly with World Vision and with Alpha Course out of London. And now I am pastoring a church myself and also part of the Healthy Growing Leaders team. Actually, Greg is my coach and my mentor, and so I'm really been excited about that over the last 2 years as he's walked alongside me, helping me become a better leader. And so, Greg, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah. Let me see. I met you about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. Yeah. Been partnering with you. I met Aaron 40 years ago. For those of you who are here, she is my daughter, and so we partnered for 40 years. And yeah, I think, all you need to know about me is I came to Christ in college at the University of Michigan. I have an engineering degree, was an engineer for General Motors, went to work, left, went to seminary, I had an MBA, worked on my MBA, then an MDiv at seminary, was a pastor of a large mega church in the 80s, one of the first original mega churches in the 80s, and then took a church turnaround in Kansas, and then I decided to plant a church in Orlando 35 years ago before it was really cool to plant churches, and God proceeded to destroy me. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go through later on podcast. But so that's all you need to know. I was a professor. I have a PhD in statistics, psychometrics, actually, which is statistics in the area of testing and measurement. So I've been a consultant, a denominational executive, and now I'm a psychometrician, or whatever that means. I've not quite figured out what I want to do when I grow up. So someday I hope I figure it out.
And we're gonna unpack what a psychometrician means because I still don't know what it means. But there'll be.
I'm not sure I do either.
Stories. Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, you'll find it interesting. I had someone call me the other day and asked me they wanted to become a psychometrician. So they said, okay, so here's how this is the certified. There's a board of certified psychometricians, and they want to know, when did I get certified? I said, young man, I actually was a psychometrician before that board was ever even founded. So I've never gotten certified by them. I don't know if they would grandfather me or not. So anyway, I don't even know if I know I'm a good psychometrician. So
you were a psychometrician before it was cool.
Yeah.
That was the thing.
He church planted before it's cool. He's psychometrician before it's cool. He likes to lead the forerunner.
There is a trend, if you'll notice. We'll talk about it. I tend to be an very early adopter, and as my mentor told me, this is seriously, my mentor told me this 30 years ago. Greg, a leader is 1 step ahead. A martyr is 7 steps ahead, and you're more often a martyr than you are a leader. And I think that's true. So
interesting. What do you think about it is about your wiring that makes you want to be on the front edge of stuff?
That's a great question. It's interesting because I remember growing up, and I always loved to start things, and I always hated. I never finished them. And I can remember my mama, who was love stability. And, she grabbed my earlobes. I remember her staring me in the eyeballs. I can remember this, like I was probably 8 or 10. I don't know what. And she says, Gregory, I knew I was always in trouble when she said Gregory, but Gregory, don't you dare start something new until you finish it. Do you understand me? Well, I really felt like I was a deficient person because I love starting things. And I felt like there was something wrong with me because I didn't always carry things through to completion, that I would get bored and go on trying new stuff. I was always asking why, and because I would ask why, I would then inevitably want to go figure it out. And so I was always trying to figure stuff out. Well, even my first mentor, he was this highly stable, godly guy. I just felt like I wasn't discipled well or I wasn't growing right because I just wasn't this steady, Freddy, stable guy. And it wasn't until into my mid 30s that I really come to be aware that no, that's my unique wiring, and especially as a leader. So I'm not going to change that wiring, but what I need to do is make sure I'm in a context where that wiring thrives. So for me, it was creating a team, always working on a team. I didn't get that right till I was in my 40s, but create a team where I could be the kind of crazy guy, but the team appreciated that, didn't see that as a deficiency, but so how could they take what I started and bring it to fulfillment or completion? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think a lot of leaders struggle with that and have that feeling of wanting to start stuff, but not want to just dump it on people's plates. And so it's one of those things. And I've worked with leaders that have been okay with just dumping it on people's plates too, which is a challenge as well.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that's always. Again, that's not healthy. That's not. I had to learn what the difference between delegation and abdication, because I would abdicate things, I just give it away and forget it. That's not healthy delegation. That's not healthy leadership. I do remember the elder of my first church, I was lead pastor, saying that, telling other people that, yeah, Greg's a loose cannon, and we just have to make sure he doesn't kill anybody. And I think that was a compliment. I'm not sure to this day whether he meant that as a compliment, but I think it was.
For sure. I wanted to talk today, and when we were kind of going back and forth on what we were going to talk about today, I want to start our first episode talking about the future of leadership. And Greg, you and I have talked about this in my own personal life. I feel like sometimes it says getting back to the new normal, or we're entering this new kind of season of leadership. And I almost think it's like a new era of leadership. I think in some ways, all the stuff that we've learned in the past on leadership is still good and fundamental to build off of. But like, we are entering into where leadership is looking a lot differently. And so I think it was accelerated by the pandemic, but I think it was already heading there. I think there's new generations that are looking for leaders to be different. And so, we've talked about this a little bit offline here, but what are you seeing as some of the greatest challenges for leaders as we think about where we're at today or even in the next 5 years?
Well, it's interesting. An article just came out today. In fact, you'll put it in the link somewhere on here. They can click on the link to that article that was just published today in a denominational magazine, where I wrote about, I think, the biggest challenge, the biggest virus basically of our culture currently is not the COVID, but it's anxiety. And I think how anxiety is just to the top. I think it's been a 100-year process, and that's what I unpack in this article. So I won't regurgitate that. But the reality is, if in fact anxiety is the real virus, what I'm seeing in leaders is that so many leaders are leading out of that anxiety rather than really leading out of calm assurance that they're doing what God wants them to do. And so for me, that it's an intriguing time, because throughout history, Christians have faced epic challenges. Persecution and in the Roman Empire, and the plagues, and you can go right on through history. And yet the leaders of the church always responded with kind of a calm assurance that this is what God's called us to do, and they move forward in that. Now, not everyone, because we weren't literally there to know everyone was manifesting that, and that's what I see lacking now. In fact, I see very few leaders in the church and outside the church, to be honest with you, but very few leaders inside the church who literally are leading with a calm assurance that God's still on the throne, and here's what we need to do. And there's this anxiety, I think, that's present. Now, it's interesting for me, and I don't want to preach, so you get me off subject. You bring me back, okay, either one of you. But if you look at Acts 1:8, Jesus says, "You'll be my disciples in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." So that's their clear marching orders. They go, and Acts 2, they have Pentecost, and the church explodes and grows, and thousands of Pharisees come to Christ, and thousands of people are healed, and all this life transformation is occurring. The first 7 chapters of Acts. And it's amazing. I mean, Acts 2:42, and they dedicated themselves to the apostles' teachings and to the breaking of bread and meeting of homes. And we know that passage, and that's been a model that's been taught in many of our churches. What I think we miss is that is not the model Paul used. Acts 8:1, we read this, and a great persecution broke out against the church. And the disciples were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. First time those 2 words have been used together since Acts 1:8. And it's intriguing. So that's a defining moment in the life of the church. Well, I say that because that's what there's been, scholars tell us, 10 to 15 years now that the leaders have been leading inside Jerusalem. They never got outside of the culture of the Jewish Judeo culture of Jerusalem. Well, now all of a sudden, I'm not saying God caused that persecution, but persecution breaks and it becomes a defining moment. Disciples are scattered. In next chapter, Acts 9, Paul comes to Christ. You know the story. And so we go on, and Paul becomes a leader of that movement. But the interesting thing is, Paul never appears to hearken back. I just wish it were like Jerusalem. I just wish we could go back and meet in the temple courts and meet from home to home and do the stuff because the model that Paul uses to plant churches, and in fact to disciple believers in the 16 or so churches that he planted around the Mediterranean area, is radically different than what we see in Acts 2. Now, I've never seen that written, but I know there'll be a lot of people who hear this that may disagree with me. But Paul never tries to recreate that Acts 2:42 through 47 model. He is all about going out where lost people are, hanging out with lost people, whether it's in Athens in the Greek temple. I mean, he's always meeting, or he'll go to synagogues where he finds God-fearers, but then he pulls them away and meet in disciples, and he seeks to build disciples, which ultimately become a church. I don't ever see him planting a church trying to make disciples. It's the other way around. He led people to Christ, tried to make disciples, out of which churches grew, and they were the structure, if you would, the mechanism, the body of Christ in which those disciples continued to grow and disciple others, for sure. So anyways, but you see Paul makes this major leadership transition that we never talk about because he doesn't lead like the Jewish leaders. In fact, we know he gets called on the carpet. Acts 15, they call him back to Jerusalem. Why aren't you teaching those people to sing music like us? How come they got tats? I mean, he's all this. I mean, circumcision is the big deal. But I mean, the reality is it's a different culture, and in Jerusalem, they never can understand how this guy Paul is culturally leading in a different way. And I think to me, this is a defining moment in the church. As you said, this is not a new thing. It's been going on for 20 years, literally. It's just COVID has sped the process up. And so now the kind of leadership we saw in the 70s and 80s is not going to be the kind of leadership in the church, I don't think, in the 30s and the 40s. It's just it's going to look different, but I'm not sure we know what it is, but it's going to look much different.
Greg, I want to parachute in the middle of your story, the Acts story. So this morning, I was actually reading Acts 4 or 5. I can't remember, but it was one of those about Peter and John standing before religious leaders, and what they're asking them to, take back what they said. And they stood there filled with the Spirit. And I think about not having that anxiety, the assurance of who they are and who God's called them to be and what they're supposed to do for this moment, and being open to God's, the Spirit speaking through them. And went against what the religious leaders, the same leaders who crucified Jesus, they spoke against them. But I was touched this morning in my own quiet time of just that rest, that assurance that they had to be able to stand before the people who just crucified Jesus and be able to speak to them with such calm confidence. And to the point of your article about anxiety, I think so many leaders, I wonder, are so confused even their own spot and their own wiring. Maybe they're trying to be like you, to be to emulate another leader that's not who they are. They're trying to be somebody they're not, and not living in that who God's called them to be for this season, and resting in that. So interesting you brought that up, because I was right in the middle of that story today, thinking about that, just that calm confidence as a leader, to know who you are in God and your leadership too.
Yeah, and for me, that's that sets the stage for everything we do at HGL. But because to me, it's the reason they were not anxious. Well, surely they were rooted in Christ. They were rooted, but it's out of that rooting and that time alone and that intimacy with Christ that they really did have confidence in who they were. Peter, he was. I mean, we'll talk at some point. Difference between Peter and Paul, radically different leaders. Same with James, same with Apollos, same with, it's just amazing to see the difference. And Paul highlights those in 1 Corinthians. But the reality is, you're right, Aaron, they were comfortable in who they were created to be, and they were able to operate out of who they were wired to be and not try to be somebody else. For me, as you heard me say, for the first 20 years of ministry, I was trying to be somebody else. In fact, you'll find this interesting. I'll never forget the first sermon I preached. I literally took Chuck Swindoll's message and memorized it verbatim, word for word. And I stood up and gave that thing memorized verbatim. And you know what? No one thought it was any good. Yet they loved Chuck Swindoll. Well, what was the problem? Well, I'm not Chuck Swindoll. And it took me a long time to figure out, Greg, you're a little bit scattered and crazy. You have to manage that. We'll get to that in another podcast. But be who God created you to be. And in your speaking, and even in this podcast, it should reflect who each of us are, not you, Aaron, being who I am, or Kurt, you being what Aaron or I am. We each need to be who we are and bring our own sense of true self to this time. So, yeah.
I was thinking, first off, stealing another person's sermon, not something you can do in 2020 anymore with YouTube. That's
I know, at that time you could.
World. Yeah, that's right. But the one of the things is, I think there's a lot written on this. I know a book that you had me read, Anxious Church, Anxious People. Which is a great one. Jack
Shitama. How'd you like to have a last name? Shitama. I mean, Shitama. Anyways, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's a great book, and Mark Sayers has been doing a lot on the podcast, and he's writing a book about non-anxious presence and church leadership. One of the questions that I have is, because I agree with you, and I'm just going to be honest, this is an area that I've been struggling with, and you've been walking alongside with me. Overwhelm, the amount of demand on us, the amount of things that are happening within, if you're a church leader or some other leader, even outside of our from our kind of stuff that's happening inside our organization, but outside our organization is coming into our organization, and you don't know what conversation you're going to have based on the outside world, let alone your inside your organization. And so what are some practical things that we can do as a leader of an organization to have that non-anxious presence? I mean, you're a psychometrician, so now we're going the psychology side. What are some things that you think we can be doing as leaders to be non-anxious?
Well, I think the first thing, and we've already alluded to that, is you got to know who you are. You got to know how you're wired. And that's, I personally think, where most people fail, most leaders fail. I don't mean just personality. I mean, emotionally and motivators and all the other kind of things that because we're more than an Enneagram. That's another thing. We're more than a number. We're more than a Myers-Briggs scale, 1 of 16. God's too creative to make us 1 of 9 or 1 of 16 or whatever. I mean, God is just so creative. I mean, all of us are wired, I am convinced, differently. I've done assessments on thousands of people over the last 35 years. Nobody's the same, because you took your hardware and your software. We're just all radically different. Well, part of it's knowing how you're wired in that way, and that's really a process. And I think you spend your first half of your life figuring out your wiring, and then the second half, you get to kind of live in that, and it's the fun part. But it's also understanding the season of spiritual growth that you're in. I mean, a lot of pastors are still in that first season, which is fine. We all have to go through that, but where your self-worth, your self-confidence is built on your performance. So most pastors are really concerned about performing and looking good and getting the church growing, and that reflects on them personally. Totally ignoring what God says, that Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God produced the growth. It wasn't either one of us produced the growth. We just created environments where God worked. I mean, I think that, so because pastors are often in that, what I call third season of growth, third stage of spiritual development, they're still trying to figure out who they are personally and spiritually. That kind of overlays not knowing themselves. So trying to be a lot of things. I really think that concretely, the nice thing about COVID, this is one of the opportunities about COVID, it provides a great opportunity to figure this stuff out. I mean, it really does. Because, I mean, you can blame whatever happens with the church, you can blame it on COVID. I mean, I hear that all the time. Pastors, well, the church is down 20%. That's just COVID. That's fine. Blame whatever. This is a perfect time to blame everything on COVID. So this is a time to experiment. I mean, I am convinced, I'm not sure that some Bridges and others who've written on change would agree with this, but I am convinced you make all the changes at once. Like if you have 15 changes to make and you can make them all at once, people are only going to be able to complain about 4 or 5 at the most. So you get 10 without even any problem. So I mean, it's just, I make them, I've done that. We'll talk later about how I've done that, but this is a great time for that because COVID is changing so much around us. What a great opportunity for pastors to figure out, well, maybe I'm not really good at this. Maybe I'm trying to fulfill someone else's shoes. Maybe I'm trying to answer someone else's call, wear someone else's armor, as David and with Saul. And here's where I'm wired. And this is going to change the role that I fill in the church from now on. I'm no longer going to do X. Can I give you an example? And I think this was going on long before COVID. This was 20 years before COVID. But here's a good example. When Maxwell said everything rises and falls on leadership, I'm sorry, John, that's trash. I mean, I know I say that and people are going to get down on me, but I don't think everything does rise and fall on a leadership person. That's how that's often most taken. Now, I agree with John if it's the function of leadership, but we all know what was taken that to mean was everything rises and falls on the leader. Because the prevalent model was the CEO model when he said that, and that was everything rises and falls on that leader. Well, that may have worked in the CEO culture that was prevalent in the 70s and 80s, but the reality is with millennials and Zs, that's no longer the reality. And if you're not able to see leadership as a team function, well, then you're not going to be able to lead in the 30s and 40s. So how are we going to, at this point, how do we know what function we provide on that team and what's the kind of team we need to develop around us and see that everything rises and falls as we lead as a team, not on me as a person. So I think COVID's a great opportunity for the pastors to no longer do the work of the ministry, but to figure out how do I create a team of people, multiple teams of people who do the work of the ministry. And I'm just here to use my gifts in a way that to create an environment for those teams to flourish. And I know that in fact, I was talking with a bunch of mega pastors once. They asked me to come in, and this is literally 25 years ago. They asked me to come in and speak on, how to work with millennials, basically. And I just said, well, you got to. They're teams. They want to be respected. They don't want to be gophers. They don't want to be you, the man, the sage on the stage with them just being a bunch of peons. And a leader of a church that many of you would know said to me, "Well, I am better than most of our people, so they better just listen to me." And my response to that leader was, see you in 25 years because you won't be leading. And he is not. Because the reality is that's not how you can lead today. We see it on television. We see it all over. But the really healthy churches, and I think COVID's a great opportunity to say, okay, well, how has God wired me? And how do I need to create a team to do ministry in this context? And how does it look different? And if it, you'll make mistakes for sure, but blame it on COVID.
That's interesting. Aaron, I know you have another question, but real quick, I think it's interesting because Aaron and I I think we're the oldest millennials, so we can speak for all.
I don't claim a millennial. I actually jumped.
Oh, okay. You're past that. I'm the oldest millennial, so I can speak for all millennials.
It matters which chart you're looking at.
So what are you, Aaron? Yeah. If you're not a millennial, what are you? You're not a boomer.
That's technically where I'm the youngest boomer.
You're not a boomer. You're not a boomer. You're not 40. You're not a boomer.
She's millennial.
I am my own person.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
All right. I know who I am. My own person.
Yeah, you can tell where she grew up.
But it's so funny, Greg, because you're my coach and my mentor, and so often you say to me that you're a terrible coach and mentor, and you're not, because one of the things that's really interesting is as a mid to late 30-year-old who's leading church for the first time, you always remind me that in all of this stuff in your 20s, 30s, and even 40s, this is just part of the learning. This is God growing you. And I actually just pulled up this study. That there's a new study, and I'm going to send this to you, that it says that the most productive years of a person's life is actually 60 to 70.
Yes,
it's
finally.
crazy to think that. I know. And actually,
I've
the
been
second
saying
one
that.
is 70 to 80.
I've been saying that so long, and no one would agree with me on that.
I know there's a new study, so I'm going to send this to you. But what's interesting is this team leadership. And I just want to speak from my perspective. One of the cool things for me is that I'm leading as a 30-year-old, but I'm actually leading with my father-in-law who's in his 60s. You're my coach who's in your 60s. One of my elders was a previous business owner, but also a pastor and been a longtime elder of churches. He's in his 60s. And so one of the things about people in their 60s is that they know their wiring, like you were talking about. They know their wiring, and they're not doing more than us in our 20s and 30s, but they know how to do the right things and move the right things forward. And they also know how, in a lot of ways, to have that non-anxious presence. And so it's not for me to figure out how to lead on my own, even though I'm in a leadership position of my own, but to have even people just speaking in my life that aren't that have are 2 or 3 roads down the, or 2 or 3 kind of, I don't know exactly
Stages
what to say, down the road
Stages,
from
yeah.
me. And so it's been a really interesting thing for me that I value a lot. And so that's an advice for me that I just wanted to throw out there, is that if you are a leader in your 20s, 30s, or even 40s, mentorship and people that you can call to just say, you're not crazy, this happens, and here's what it looks like moving forward.
Yeah, whenever you see me look over here to my right, I'm looking at my books. But there's a book, Izzy, it's not even a Christian book, wrote on, I think we'll get the title right, but it's like the 5 truths you got to discover before you die. Anyways, and in that he says, this is really cool. They're trying to discover what are truths that people surely need to know from a secular perspective. And so they go out and he has a podcast, and he has thousands of people. So they literally ask, for people to submit names of people who they think have figured out a truth that they need to live by. And they get 5,000 names, and they call all these names down. They call them until they get down to about 300, I think. The numbers may be off here, but they get about 300. And they go out and begin interviewing all these people. And halfway through, they came back and they changed the process, because all the people they were interviewing were primarily over 50. But they began to notice there was a big difference between the group 50 to 60 and those that were over 60. And the difference they noticed was that those people who were below 60, 50 to 60 primarily, still were trying to prove themselves. And the truths that they were trying to share were still more proofing themselves. And yet over 60, there was a sense where they no longer cared whether anyone believed them or not. And they just were, there's a freedom that existed. And so they literally stopped the study and then only focused on people over 60. There were 2 exceptions. I think there were 59, but it was so cool because they discovered qualitatively there's a difference in life when one gets to over 60 where you're no longer worried about performing or whether people like you or are going to follow you. It's just, this is what you've learned. And we'll unpack this later, but it's really cool for Paul. Most people don't realize Paul had 35 years of ministry. I mean, I guess before I did the chronological timeline study, I thought he had, 10 years or whatever. No, comes to Christ sometime mid to late 20s, doesn't die, doesn't kill until he's 65 or mid to 60s somewhere. So he's had at least 35 years. Well, if you study his life, his most significant decade was his last decade of leadership. And I am convinced that if we live godly, growing, open lives, our most significant impact of leadership will occur the last decade of our leadership. Paul, we'll go through it later, but he had 13 of the 16 churches he planted. He did that last decade. 37 of the 47 people he's listed as discipling in the New Testament, he did the last decade. it's just unbelievable to look at the impact he did the last decade versus the 25 years before that. So I am convinced that most people make this leadership decisions best on the next decade rather than the last decade.
Last decade. So, question with that, Greg, and it's funny. So, my husband and I got married at 22, right out of college. I turned 40 here in a few weeks. And when we were 22, we couldn't wait to be 40. But we were those weird ones that just thought, because at 40, you have more wisdom and experience than you do at 22. And now we're at 40 and realize, oh, like we have so much more we need to go. We thought by 40 we'd have it figured out, but now at 40 we're like we have so much more. And I think because I keep hearing from Greg too that Lily's the 60s. So Greg, I know time doesn't produce that in a leader. I mean, just there are leaders in their 60s that don't live in that freedom of who God that made them to be. So what would you say to leaders? I mean, every decade's different, 20, 30s, 40s, 50s to what healthy things do we do now in our earlier decades to get us to the point, and again, you just mentioned about planning towards that last decade, but what do we do now to help us be in a better spot? And maybe even, I don't, again, a lot of us, I guess I can be a millennial, want to get there sooner. Part of it's just time in the process, but what can we be doing now? And that maybe even we could be somewhere, maybe in our 50s, doing some things better than we would have if we weren't being prepared earlier.
That's a great question. What do you think? I whenever I say that, I'm thinking, so it's giving me time to think.
Okay, so it's a good thing. Yeah.
No, for me, I think there's a couple things that come right to mind, Aaron. First is you got to deal with the expectation, and you know it as well as I do, that if you haven't hit your peak by 40, there's something wrong. I mean, if I didn't have my mega church in process when I was 40, I thought I had failed, and I really did. My church plant. One of the ways God broke me was to say, your expectations are whacked out, Greg. But most of us grow up with this expectation that if I haven't hit the peak, the pinnacle, the ultimate respect by 40 or between 45 and 50, I've failed. So that's the first thing, is you have to deal with that expectation, because that isn't true. I don't believe that's biblical, and I don't think it's sound. So first to deal with expectation. And second,
it's harder. I would guess it's even harder for 40-year-olds now than when you were 40, because the social media, the platforms, the internet, you can see the success of so many others right in your face, and you see their parents' success of it. We don't know the backstories, but where it's like, oh, I'm supposed to be there, especially for younger in your 20s and 30s. You look at the 40-year-olds, like, well, look what they're doing. I need to be doing that. That lie can be weaved probably more in there too, with just the information we have accessible to us.
Yeah, and to be very candid, in my generation, it was conferences. All the conferences were led by the 40-year-olds who had mega churches. Today, it's social media platforms. All the ones who have all the followers are ones who had their success by the time they're 40. Now, the cool thing is, that's one thing I like about getting old, is now that I'm 68, or I will be 68 this year, I mean, I look around me at men and women my age. There are very few. I mean, all those ones who were in their 40s were at the peak, and we had all these leading conferences, writing books. Where are they now? So I think that's the second thing. The first thing is adjusting your expectations. The second thing is and this is going to sound strange, but Jesus says, he who is faithful with little will be trusted with much. In Luke, I think it's 11. And the reality is, for me, it was, am I going to be faithful with the little things in my 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s? Am I going to continue to grow mentally? Am I going to continue to read and not become calcified in my beliefs, my thoughts? I mean, not the gospel issues, but I mean, I've changed a lot the last 20, 30 years and learned so much. So, but mentally, it's spiritually. Am I spending time every day with my Lord in prayer and quiet time? Am I still studying his word? Not studying his word so I can preach better, but studying his word so God can transform me. Even I just finished one of Richard Rohr's book, which, radically stretched some of my limits. That's okay at this point in my life. I need to be being stretched spiritually as well. So one is dealing with expectations. The other is being faithful to little things in the growth areas. Are you still growing? And one of the things I ask people when I do assessments is, so how are you different now than you were 10 years ago? And that's a really good question, because if you're not growing, you may point to some superficial things. Well, I run now, I didn't run then, or I do this. But I want to know, as in your character, in your essence, how do you see yourself? So I think you should see yourself changed every decade. So for me, it's being faithful and growing, Aaron. And so I think the third and final thing would be, and I'm not sure these are in order, but is self-awareness. I mentioned a moment ago that I was, I realized that I'm a terrible finisher. I'm a great starter, and I love starting things. I love doing that kind of stuff. Well, my whole self-awareness was becoming, what needs was I meeting, and becoming self-aware. And as I became self-aware, knowing where I needed to grow. And so, I mean, I love Adam Grant's book Originals, because he talks about people like me who were often serial entrepreneurs and so forth. We manage our portfolio of risk. And what he means by that, and it's very true of my life, is I had to learn that I can be really creative in ministry and think and in growing and all those things, but I have to have some routine in other areas of my life. So, for instance, I have a very consistent schedule. I work out. I have some, my quiet time, my journaling. There's some very consistent routines I do. I minimize risk. Even I don't, at this point, wear a lot of different colors in my stuff because I minimize. So when I get up in the morning, I know what I have to put on, especially if I'm on video. But the reality is, by managing my risk portfolio, it frees me up to take risk in these other areas, thinking and so forth. Well, see, that came from self-awareness. That came aware of, these are some of, that's those little hints wouldn't help other people, but they help me because that's where I needed to really grow. And so in my 30s and 40s, I established a lot of routines and habits that provided a solid foundation from which now I can really flourish. I read a lot. I have a consistent walk. And exercise, those kinds. I eat well. But that was my self-awareness, which led to how I needed to grow. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep, that makes sense.
And again, I think that's different for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I think about a leader you and I worked with yesterday, who we do debriefs with HGL where people take 5 to 7 assessments, depending on the package. And then we sit with them for a couple hours on a Zoom and talk through their assessments. And this individual, which actually, he's 45 years old, and, it became very apparent that he was taking the assessments to the role. He wanted to, he was too good. He was like the perfect package for this turnaround restart church. Too good, and it was too good to be true. And just thinking about, we talked about the lack of self-awareness, that's not helpful to him. That's not helpful to his church, to the kingdom. Just trying to be, kind of back to the point we were earlier, trying to be somebody we're not, it's not helpful to any of those three things. And he's 45, and you hope that someone getting into your 40s have more self-awareness to establish things that manage the areas that about yourself, or to find those routines and have that awareness and know who you are and comfortable in that, and then build a team around that, build systems in your own life around that. That's definitely I think a linchpin in leadership and moving forward, whether it's dealing with anxiety or growing into the comfort level you have at 68 that some don't have. So,
well, yeah, and I think that there's so much wisdom in that. For me, if we're not getting a handle on areas that we need to grow in our 30s and 40s, usually the reason is because we're experiencing such success that we're not forced to be self-reflective. And for me, the interesting thing is it's only after crisis, as I mentioned to you, it was my breaking that came through church planting, a church for 14 years. It's usually crisis, trauma, or some kind of wall, as Clinton would talk about in The Making of a Leader, that forces the person, the leader, to say, well, you know what? I'm not probably doing things where I need to, and I need to reflect. Now, what happens is most people, depending on who you believe, some say it's as high as 90% of leaders in Christianity, but the majority, I think, get to that crisis and then just simply go back to the third stage, in my terms, and they just get back to the performance, doing what they can do. They go to another church, try it again, do the same thing over again. They try it in another team, another location, whatever, rather than sitting in it and doing the deep work to say, how does it? In fact, there's a great book, Deep Change by Quinn, where he said business leaders, not even a believer that I'm aware of, but say business leaders. And his point was, before you could ever provide change in an organization, you personally have to go through deep change. He only came to that through 40 years of research with leaders in organizations. And the interesting thing, the conclusion of the book, it's a very deep book, but the conclusion is that if you go into an organization to change it, and you need to do the deep change, from my perspective, as God shows you the change you need to bring into your own life, you will change deeply, but you may never see the organization change, because most often, in Quinn's observations, the leader moves on before the organization embraces the change. And you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with God worked in you to change. And I just to complete the church planting breaking for me, it was, I, God did some tremendous work inside of me. And it doesn't matter what happened to the church. I'm okay. I can say to you, the church never got over 200. I never became the mega church. I was a failure in many people's eyes, and that's okay. God did his work in me, and that was the important part.
And since I have an outside perspective here, during that broken season is what led you back to get your doctorate, your PhD in psychometrics, because you want to make sure you can support our family, which now has allowed you, like, place that church closed when you were leading it, which now has allowed you in that that 60s right now to be fully, I mean, if you didn't have that breaking season and that lack of success that others would have seen, you would have never gone down the path where you are, and you wouldn't be where you are today. So, I mean, I'm always, again, I've had the perspective to watch it and to remind us that God's plan is so big, and what we see as breaking is so beautiful if you allow it to be, if you don't go backwards to where you're unhealth. And God can use, again, even just a simple thing of you want to provide for your family and have another degree, another opportunity for career, to do what you do now, which is such a unique niche, to have all your experience together. So one thing you'll experience on our podcast with Greg is that he will recommend books. Often you'll hear a lot of books. And so he is always listening and reading them, and he'll give us some great insights on books, Christian and non-Christian books and leadership. So that's a great place to learn from those. The one he just mentioned was Deep Change too. So who's the author on that one?
Robert Quinn. Again, I only probably 10% of people that I work with can really read that, because it's really deep. Okay. It's really good. But, and it's interesting. I want to share with you, Aaron, during that same era, that church planting era, it sounds really cool to say in hindsight, look at what God has done. And it is. Look at it. I mean, I wouldn't be where I am today without that failure and those struggles. But when you're in the midst and you don't see the end, I didn't see when I was 68. It was really tough. Because I did, just as I told somebody, that I feel like I'm beating my head against a brick wall. My head's bloody. But the bad thing is I feel the brick wall is God. And yet, it's when you're in that time, it's really tough to be encouraged, especially people who are in COVID. In fact, you'll find it's interesting. There were 3 of us that planted churches same time, one in Kansas City, one in Arizona, Phoenix, and one here. I did here. Those other 2 went to 2,000 people. Those churches exploded, did very, very well. I never got over 200. And so at the time we were getting together as friends, and the one pastor said to me, "You know what? I'm 5 times better preacher than you are." And I won't argue whether he was or wasn't a better communicator than I, but I said, "Well, that's kind of stupid. Why would you say that?" "Well, because we're at 1,000, you're at 200. And I can't tell you how that hurt my heart. This is a friend said this. But that was the thinking, that if you were that good, you'd be that big. And no clue what God is doing, no clue deep down inside. And today, I wouldn't trade being where that person is for any unlimited dollars. But again, it pierced my heart. It hurt. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think a lot of leaders, Kirk, come back to your issue, in COVID are experiencing a lot of inner pain. The question is, how are you allowing God to use that inner pain to produce what he wants to do in your life? Because to me, the key to leadership is becoming the leader God has called you to be. And if you're doing the work to become the leader God wants you to be over your lifetime, let him worry about the scope of your ministry. You just worry about the depth of your ministry.
That's good. And in light of this conversation, the thing that I keep hearing over and over again is, you can read every book, you can figure everything out, but mentorship really just keeps coming into my mind. And if you're a young leader, you're going to go through this kind of stuff. Talk to somebody who's been through it to help you grow within it, rather than, I find myself like you, Greg, where you're hitting up against a brick wall and you just keep hitting your head. But a mentor helps you, figure out how to process what you're going through to make you stronger. And the older generation, be open to mentoring younger generation. I think there's a huge gap happening right now within that, and I think it's a lot of pride from the younger generation and probably pride from the older generation. But we have to figure this out, because leading an organization, and then also I'll bring this up. I found mentorship outside of your organization is a big thing for me. Meaning Greg's my mentor. He helps me lead my church, but he's focused on me as an individual growing as a leader, not growing my church. Does that make sense? And so he doesn't have any, you don't have any horse, in the race. It's more, hey, Kurt, let's take care of you. And we'll talk about your church, but I'm here to help you. And so that's a big thing. So anyway, I think the future of leadership, in some ways, there's no tactical way around this. It's dealing with our deep stuff and getting healthy and growing as leaders.
Yeah, let me just say this, that if you look for a mentor, I couldn't agree with you more. I've paid for coaches, mentors. My current mentor is 10 years older than I, and he's been my mentor for 23 years. I mean, it's unbelievable. He's chairman of my board, actually. But the reality is, whoever you get as a mentor, it needs to be able, and this is one of the fallacies of people my age as mentoring. We try to recreate in others what happened in us. See, the leader has to be able to coach beyond themselves. The mentor has to be able to coach beyond themselves. They have to be able to look at a Kurt and say, Kurt, you're different than I. You're wired. You've got a different background. You got some software that I don't have. So I can't my goal isn't to reproduce what happened in me in you, but it's how do I help God do in you what he wants to do? And that's, as you look for a mentor, that would be one thing that I would look for is this person able to coach beyond their own experience? Because I've seen that unfortunate part where people just simply coach out of who their own experience has made them, and they're not able to coach people who are different from them. And I've been the receiver of that. People have tried to make me into who they were rather than saying, for instance, one of my mentors said to me, that I should not plant a church because, the reason was because you should just be a pastor, stable, steady pastor your whole life, one church kind of thing. Well, again, he had no clue. Though he'd been my mentor for 10 years, had really no clue of understanding that I was not wired like he was. So,
yep. Yeah, I think that's a future podcast. We should mark that down, of maybe even getting your mentor, who I got to meet in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago, and he's an incredible human, and just talk about mentorship, because I think, gosh, the generational of that, just looking at that, of him mentoring you mentoring me, and whom I'm mentoring, is the question that keeps coming into my mind, even though I'm only 38. But I think that is how the church has existed for years, and grown. So I think we're going to end it here. Our first episode. Greg, you mentioned a ton of books. Aaron mentioned it as well. What should leaders each week? What's a book they should be reading right now? And you can use one that you already mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think if you're experiencing a lot of anxiety, Anxious Church, Anxious People by Shatama is really good. If you're trying to change an organization but not change yourself, I think, Deep Change. There's Managing Leadership Anxiety by Steve Cust is a great book. He wrote just before COVID. I find it very interesting, but it's about leadership anxiety. It's kind of a personal dialogue. So those would be 3. Any other ones I mentioned in here? Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it. Aaron, any last words as we get going here?
Good to go.
Awesome. Well, I thank you so much for your time, Greg. We're going to do it again in a little bit. And like I said, each week we're just going to try to have honest conversations, but kind of on the soft side of leadership, not just the tactical side, but what does it mean to be a healthy, growing leader in today's world? So thanks so much, and we'll see you in a bit.